Are you ready to learn the truth about how a tiny band of outsiders brought down the greatest empire of its time from within? At first glance, this seems absolutely impossible, even a legendary event. A vast state with a disciplined army and endless resources suddenly collapsed under the onslaught of just a couple hundred adventurers. We're used to thinking that the outcome of such clashes was decided solely by swords and armor, but the reality turns out to be much more complex and interesting. Traditional history focuses on technology, steel blades, and the invaders' firearms. Of course, horses and gunpowder terrified the indigenous people, who had never seen anything like it in their lives.
However, the true reason lies in the unprecedented psychological pressure and masterful manipulation of the enemy's mind.
The conquerors acted not as soldiers, but as subtle strategists who understood the weaknesses of the human psyche. While the people waited for a sign from their divine leader, the invaders consolidated their positions and sowed discord among the nobility. Religious and social foundations, built over centuries, began to crumble rapidly before the eyes of the terrified population.
No one dared to raise a hand against the enemy, while their lord was held hostage behind the palace's stone walls.
Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how the capture of a single man paralyzed millions and caused an empire to vanish forever. I will reveal the best-kept secret of the Conquistador's success, which lay in a complete understanding of the mechanisms of absolute centralized power. The Spanish expedition found itself in the heart of a foreign continent, tightly surrounded by thousands of local militiamen in an unfamiliar environment. They had no real means of retreating safely to the coast, and their fresh water supplies were rapidly dwindling. In this situation, a classic direct siege of the gigantic island capital meant certain failure, so the expedition leader chose a different strategy.
The imperial capital consisted of a complex network of massive stone buildings, wide plazas, and deep artificial waterways.
The city's island location made it virtually impregnable to a standard invasion, using conventional land-based tactical maneuvers. The wide causeways connecting the city to the mainland could easily be blocked by wooden drawbridges, reliably isolating the central government quarters. The strangers needed to get inside these high walls without resistance, using diplomacy as their primary weapon. The ruler of the empire himself opened the gates of his capital, guided by complex political calculations and a desire to control the unknown guests. He stationed the detachment in his predecessor's enormous stone palace, which was located in the very center of the island metropolis. This palace had high, thick walls, spacious inner courtyards, and numerous large rooms for storing state reserves. This decision proved to be a fatal strategic mistake, allowing the strangers to establish themselves unhindered at the very heart of the state's administrative apparatus. However, from then on, every order he issued was first coordinated with the commander of the conquistadors, who was constantly at his side.
The emperor became a very convenient and obedient instrument for transmitting the will of others across the vast territories under his control.
This quiet and carefully planned coup allowed the Spaniards to take full control of vast resources without destroying the city's infrastructure. They began systematically removing valuables from the capital, sending small detachments to remote provinces under the cover of imperial mandates. Local residents were deeply confused, completely unaware of whom their leader actually answered to now. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think of such a striking tactic for the bloodless takeover of an entire state? Share your thoughts in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Guess what happened next in this tense game for control of the continent's richest city? By capturing the monarch, the conquistadors gained full, unimpeded access to the administrative system of a vast state without destroying its fundamental foundations. The Spanish commander used the ruler's unquestioned authority to carry out a massive requisition of vast quantities of food from the main state granaries. Local officials carried out these strange orders unquestioningly and punctually, considering them legitimate directives from their lawful sovereign. A highly peculiar atmosphere took hold within the palace walls, where the captive and his guards spent entire days together. The Spaniards scrupulously observed the complex local etiquette, showing the emperor emphatically deep respect in the presence of his numerous subjects. This masterful theatrical production was vital to avoid provoking premature unrest in the metropolis of millions.
The ruler himself gradually began to believe that his high status remained inviolable, despite the actual restrictions.
All the treasures found were regularly carried to the spacious central courtyard of the residence for subsequent melting down into convenient standard ingots. Unique pieces of jewelry of incredibly fine workmanship, possessing immense cultural value, were methodically melted down for the sake of convenience in their further transportation. The clang of heavy hammers smashing golden ornaments echoed far beyond the high walls of the Spanish stone fortifications. This pragmatic process sparked deep, though as yet hidden, discontent among the local aristocracy, who watched the loss of their heritage.
The emperor tried in vain to ease the growing tension by offering the Spaniards ever new gifts from his personal reserves.
He regularly sent swift messengers to the most remote provinces with a categorical order to collect additional tribute for the guests. The conquistadors keenly sensed the shift in the locals' moods, noticing the cold, distant stares in the city markets. The familiar silence on the wide streets gradually gave way to a constant, barely perceptible hum of many voices discussing the coming changes. The Spaniards found themselves trapped in a luxurious golden cage, surrounded by an endless ocean of the crowd's growing and very palpable hostility. Are you ready to learn exactly how this colossal tension escalated into open conflict and shifted the balance of power? What I am about to reveal is banned in 12 countries, for it proves how a single wrong decision can bring everything crashing down. While the chief commander of the conquistadors was forced to leave the city to resolve logistical issues on the coast, the garrison was led by his deputy. This temporary governor lacked his superior's diplomatic flexibility entirely and was accustomed to relying exclusively on straightforward force. The contingent left behind was reduced to an absolute minimum, which made the Spaniards even more dependent on the moods of the vast local population. The governor saw a secret conspiracy in every daily movement of the townspeople and was in a state of constant and uncontrollable suspicion.
During the main traditional festival, the entire high-ranking capital aristocracy gathered in the spacious inner courtyard of the central temple.
In accordance with strict local traditions, all the noble participants in the ceremony came to this important square without any heavy equipment. The governor, succumbing to his fears, ordered armed soldiers to quietly block all possible exits from this enclosed stone compound. After that, the Spanish detachment began to systematically and methodically corner the unarmed elite, depriving the city of its entire administrative apparatus. This rash action became the very spark that had been so long awaited, instantly igniting all the pent-up anger in the vast metropolis. Hundreds of the city's most distinguished and respected citizens left this world forever, falling onto the smooth stone slabs of the ancient square. News of this treacherous and unexpected act by the outsiders spread like wildfire to all the remote artisan districts of the island capital. The muffled murmur of the outraged crowd turned into a deafening and furious roar as thousands of people rushed toward the city center. In response to these words, a hail of heavy stones and various wooden projectiles flew from the dense crowd.
One of the massive stones struck the ruler squarely in the head, delivering a fatal blow of immense and destructive force.
He slowly collapsed onto the flat roof of the palace, and this fall symbolized the final collapse of his long-standing absolute power. The monarch's departure meant the instant severing of the last tenuous thread, binding the Spaniards to the legitimacy of their presence in this capital. The city administration instantly chose a new ruler, an incredibly resolute young military commander, utterly unwilling to make any compromises. He ordered the blockade to be tightened as much as possible, additional high barricades to be erected on all streets, and the invaders' movement to be completely blocked. The pressure on the palace's thick walls became absolutely relentless, with waves of attackers rolling in one after another without long pauses. The soldiers were forced to stand at their posts around the clock without sleep, repelling the constant pressure of the massive crowds of locals. Please like this video if you enjoy such in-depth historical analysis. What if I told you that everything you believed in is a lie, and that salvation does not lie in flight? Supplies of precious black powder were rapidly running out, and the palace's stone walls were beginning to show ominous structural cracks. The inner courtyards were completely littered with debris from the cladding and shells that rained down from the sky in a nearly continuous downpour. The commander of the conquistadors clearly realized that continuing to passively hold their positions would inevitably lead to the complete loss of the entire expeditionary force. The only logical way out of this situation was a covert breakout from the besieged metropolis under the cover of thick night darkness. The detailed retreat plan called for moving as quietly as possible along the shortest embankment leading to the safe, solid mainland. The unit's engineers began hastily constructing portable wooden bridges from sturdy beams salvaged from the partially destroyed inner palace structures. These structures were vital for quickly crossing the deep gaps in the canals created by the locals. Complete silence and heavy rain were to be their main allies in this desperate and extremely risky attempt. The Spaniards who survived and made it to dry land presented an incredibly pitiful sight, stripped of all their former grandeur and pride. They had lost absolutely all their artillery, strategic gunpowder reserves, and any convenient means of traversing rough terrain. Their morale was completely shattered by the clear realization of their crushing and unconditional defeat at the hands of the local militia. At that moment, it seemed to the capital's residents that the empire had won a final victory, having permanently driven the invaders from its territory. The local population immediately began actively rebuilding the destroyed bridges and clearing the capital's wide streets of any traces of the foreign presence. The island city celebrated its miraculous liberation, returning to the familiar, measured rhythm of its complex administrative and cultural life. The victors collected captured weapons and the remains of abandoned equipment, carefully studying the principles behind the creation of European metalwork. Are you ready to learn how exactly this euphoria of victory gave way to the most terrible ordeal in the history of the state? The retreating, demoralized detachment was forced to march non-stop along the lake's long shoreline, constantly coming under attack from small groups of pursuers. They needed to reach the safe territory of their few loyal allies among the neighboring tribes as quickly as possible and at any cost. The long journey led through arid, rocky plains, where the Europeans suffered terribly from the unbearable daytime heat and lack of water. Every new kilometer was a struggle, and the constant nervous tension drained the last meager remnants of their physical strength. After several days of this grueling march, they unexpectedly encountered a massive imperial regular army blocking their path. Local commanders quickly assembled a colossal fresh force to destroy this weakened band of outsiders once and for all. The Spaniards hastily formed a tight classical square, preparing to defend their positions at all costs in this inevitable clash. A complete lack of gunpowder forced them to revert entirely to the ancient tactic of a static defense, with a closed formation of long pikes. At the very climax and most tense moment of the confrontation, the Spanish leader spotted the richly decorated palanquins of the commander-in-chief of the vast enemy army. Gathering a small reserve detachment of heavily armed infantry officers, he launched an incredibly desperate and swift breakthrough straight into the center of the formation. The powerful and unexpected onslaught completely stunned the personal guard, and the Spaniards managed to deprive the enemy leader of his command position. The loss of the supreme commander instantly triggered a chain reaction and deep panic in the dense ranks of the imperial army, forcing it to retreat. The victim of this unprecedented demographic catastrophe was the empire's brand new ruler, who had so successfully led the expulsion of the Spaniards. His sudden departure from office triggered a profound political crisis at the very heart of an already weakened state. In just a few months, the great empire had permanently lost a vast portion of its active population and its most outstanding military leaders. The defenders' forces were dwindling before their very eyes, transforming the magnificent, impregnable capital into a vast, incredibly quiet and silent stone labyrinth. Having assembled this truly massive combined army, the conquistadors began their systematic and relentless advance against the enemy's weakened positions. They captured coastal cities one after another, completely cutting off the island capital from its fertile agricultural provinces and resources. The local loyal warriors resisted desperately, but the coordinated joint actions of the Spaniards and their allies inexorably tightened the tight ring of the blockade. The empire found itself in absolute and hopeless isolation, forever confined within the narrow confines of its artificial man-made island. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how easily even the most majestic cities crumble under the pressure of circumstances? When the Spanish sailing fleet emerged onto the vast expanse of the inland lake, it scattered the fleet of local traditional canoes with incredible ease. The ships completely blocked all known waterways, depriving the remaining defenders of their last hope of receiving fresh supplies from the mainland. The siege became total and absolute, turning the magnificent architectural masterpiece into a giant trap for its utterly exhausted inhabitants. On the narrow earthen embankments, incredibly fierce positional battles began, lasting for days, for every meter of land and every surviving bridge. The attackers advanced extremely slowly, methodically demolishing every captured stone house so as not to leave the enemy any cover. They used the heavy rubble of the buildings to fill in the water channels, creating wide, flat areas for the safe maneuvering of their units. The city, which had once awed the entire continent with its grandeur, was systematically wiped off the face of the earth, turning into a completely flat, lifeless plain. The defenders were forced to retreat deeper into their neighborhoods, having no physical means to halt the systematic destruction of their homeland. The last emperor made a desperate attempt to break through the tight blockade in a fast canoe, accompanied by his family and chief advisors. He sincerely hoped to secretly reach the mainland and organize a long-term resistance in the remote mountainous regions of his vanishing empire. However, agile Spanish patrol ships intercepted his lone boat in open water with incredible speed and forced him to surrender immediately. The capture of this last monarch put a definitive end to months of grueling confrontation and marked the end of an entire historical era. The victors were left with a magnificent city that had been almost completely destroyed by their own methodical and purposeful, devastating siege efforts. Instead of the expected fabulous mountains of pure gold, they found only endless ruins and a local population exhausted by long and severe hardships. The simple soldiers' greatest dreams of untold personal riches were cruelly shattered by the harsh visual reality of total urban and demographic collapse. How much do you think the reality of war differs from the expectations people enter it with? This profound disappointment sparked a new wave of widespread outrage among the motley ranks of the conquistadors, who categorically demanded their promised share of the spoils. To at least somewhat satisfy the growing greed of his men, the commander immediately ordered a thorough search for all the missing palace treasures. They meticulously searched the muddy bottom of the lake in the very spots where the detachment had lost its belongings in panic during the retreat. Engineers tried to pry out the secret locations of the possible storage of the Imperial State Gold Reserve from the surviving high-ranking officials of the destroyed administration. However, the overwhelming majority of the incredible riches vanished without a trace, forever becoming an alluring myth that would stir the minds of treasure hunters for many decades. The conquest of the vast capital was merely the very first step in the long and complex process of establishing total control over the continent. It was decided to rebuild the metropolis, which had been razed to the ground, but this time according to strict and pragmatic European urban planning and architectural canons. Engineers laid out wide, straight avenues, permanently filling the ancient deep canals with construction debris and massive stones from the collapsed tall pyramids. The entire local economy was instantly and completely reoriented exclusively toward the mass export of extracted resources to distant and insatiable Europe. Unique and complex craft traditions, formed over centuries, quickly faded away, as the need to create luxury items for the aristocracy had disappeared. Instead, the local population was thrown into the development of large-scale mining and extensive agriculture in the interests of the new masters. The old value system collapsed, and gold finally became the sole and absolute measure of success on this profoundly changed continent. New laws were written in a language that the overwhelming majority of indigenous people did not understand at all and could not learn quickly. This created a massive barrier, depriving people of any chance to defend their basic rights in the courts of a new, completely alien administration. Even the most basic traditions of daily life were strictly regulated by European standards, erasing any manifestations of unique local identity and culture. A once proud and independent people were rapidly being transformed into a faceless labor force for a vast and ruthless transcontinental economic machine. The continent's toponymy also underwent a total transformation. The ancient names of rivers, mountains, and settlements were replaced with the names of Spanish saints. Maps were redrawn, and history was rewritten from the perspective of exclusive European superiority and the historical inevitability of this massive military conquest. The capture of a single emperor at the very outset of the conflict truly became the key that unlocked the door to the complete annihilation of the civilization. A system of government built around the figure of an absolute monarch proved to be the ideal mechanism for the rapid and effective dismantling of the entire state. The numerous tribes that had so actively and selflessly aided the conquistadors in the siege of the capital sincerely expected gratitude and the granting of broad autonomy. In the very early stages, their most influential leaders did indeed receive certain symbolic privileges and the formal right to retain the trappings of power. They were temporarily exempted from paying heavy tribute and could nominally govern their ancestral lands according to old traditions. However, this pleasant illusion of freedom did not last long, as the economic appetites of the new colonial administration grew at an incredible rate. Having firmly established themselves in the new territories, the Spaniards began to view their former loyal allies solely as an additional and easily accessible resource. They began to gradually introduce a European system of taxation, which proved to be far more burdensome than the tribute of the collapsed local centralized empire. Tribal leaders were surprised to discover that their actual power was rapidly eroding, while all key decisions were being made by European officials. Any attempts to openly protest or remind them of past merits and comrades in arms were harshly suppressed by the threat of superior military force. The history of these tribes is a classic and tragic example of how short-sighted local politics leads to a global geopolitical catastrophe. The desire to take revenge on their long-standing powerful neighbor deprived them of the ability to adequately assess the true long-term goals of the strangers who had arrived from across the ocean. The conquistadors brilliantly exploited the continent's long-standing internal conflicts, harnessing the energy of hatred to destroy the strongest regional powers. Once the main barrier, the empire, had fallen, the remaining scattered tribes became incredibly easy prey for the superbly organized European machine. The tragedy of the conquered peoples was compounded by the fact that they themselves actively and voluntarily destroyed the only force that could have helped them. The mighty empire, despite all its cruelty, possessed sufficient resources to mount a large-scale and sustained resistance against any major external invasion. By helping the Spanish overthrow the emperor, the tribes effectively destroyed the continent's only reliable shield, opening the door to full-scale European colonial expansion. This historical irony forever altered the demographic and cultural map of a vast part of the world, leaving behind only ruins and regrets. The question of the empire's gold, which had mysteriously vanished during the siege, continued to seriously poison the general atmosphere among the victors for many years. The rank-and-file soldiers, who had risked their lives daily during the grueling campaign, felt cheated, having received none of the promised fair share of the immense riches. They increasingly suspected their commander of having secretly appropriated a vast portion of the treasures and safely hidden them from the crown. In the fortified Spanish camp, heated conflicts constantly flared up, fueled by mutual suspicion, immense accumulated fatigue, and uncontrollable human envy. The search for hidden treasures became a veritable obsession for many adventurers who continued to arrive en masse on this continent. The vast lake, at the bottom of which, it was believed, lay untold riches, was repeatedly subjected to detailed attempts at exploration and partial drainage. These efforts gave rise to endless intrigues, betrayals, and ruined lives, proving that gold possesses an incredible ability to destroy the moral foundations of society. The myth of these treasures lives on today, attracting enthusiasts and historians with its unsolved and very dark historical mystery. Paradoxically, the continent's true wealth turned out to be not gold at all, but entirely new varieties of high-yield crops and fertile lands. They permanently and radically transformed the diet of the global population, contributing to a massive and uncontrollable demographic explosion across Europe. However, in the age of conquest, no one could fully appreciate this incredible potential. Blinded by the glitter of yellow metal in the palace treasuries, The true value of the newly discovered territories was realized by the global community very gradually over the course of many subsequent, long, and difficult decades. The total plundering of the continent left a deep, unhealing wound in the cultural heritage of all of civilized humanity, forever depriving us of much unique knowledge. Works of art, melted down into faceless ingots, carried with them the incredible secrets of ancient, highly skilled masters and their unique worldview. We can only guess at the level of aesthetic development this civilization had reached in conditions of complete and absolute isolation. This is an irreparable loss that constantly reminds us of the monstrous price humanity pays for its ruthless imperial and economic ambitions. The conquest and destruction of the great empire became a turning point, not only for one distant continent, but for the rest of the world as well. The vast and uninterrupted flow of valuable resources pouring in from the newly founded colonies forever changed the basic economic model of European states. Traditional global trade routes shifted rapidly, and new global players with unprecedented ambitions confidently emerged on the world political stage. A seemingly local conflict between a handful of desperate European adventurers and an Indian ruler set in motion the massive gears of the complex mechanism of the first true globalization. The tactic of psychological breakthrough and covert control, successfully applied in the empire's capital, found its way into classic textbooks on military strategy. It demonstrated incredibly clearly that neutralizing a single decision-making center is far more effective and cheaper than destroying a massive army on the battlefield. This principle of pinpoint decapitation of a complex command system was actively applied in subsequent conflicts of various scales over the centuries. Understanding the enemy's psychology and its main vulnerabilities became a crucial element in the training of all modern elite military and political strategists. The study of these distant events is necessary for humanity not to make belated moral judgments, but to understand the fundamental mechanisms of the historical process. It clearly shows how incredibly quickly even the most stable and powerful world order can collapse under the pressure of completely unforeseen external circumstances. The illusion of absolute and complete control over a situation is often the most significant harbinger of an imminent and inevitable systemic geopolitical catastrophe. This distant historical example teaches us to always be prepared for sudden changes and never to underestimate even the smallest opponents. Every shattered stone of the palace and every gold ornament melted down into a standard ingot carries vital information about the past. They silently tell us a story of incredible human ambition, profound fatal mistakes, and a striking, unyielding will for absolute power. This story is devoid of naive romanticism. It is extremely pragmatic, very cold, and demonstrates the true, harsh nature of large-scale human conflicts. The capture of the emperor in his own residence will forever remain an unsurpassed example of a perfect political diversion that changed the face of our entire planet. Ultimately, the fall of this vast empire proves that the most reliable fortress is one that cannot be breached from within. When a people lose faith in their leaders and their own ideals, no thick stone walls or deep water barriers can save them. Psychological defeat in the minds of the people always precedes final and unconditional physical defeat on the actual battlefield or in the capital. This law of history is universal across all continents and eras, reminding us of the need for constant development and internal cohesion within society. We see that the fall of a vast empire was the result not only of technological superiority, but also of incredibly subtle tactical and psychological calculation. The capture of the leader broke the will of millions of people, clearly proving that absolute power often rests solely on the fragile illusion of total control. This episode of history demonstrates how a tiny group of people can completely change the fate of a vast continent by acting quickly, unconventionally, and decisively. Share your thoughts in the comments, suggest topics for future videos you'd like to see, and be sure to subscribe to our channel.